Welcome to our event with Jenny Town on nuclear negotiations with North Korea. I'm Lynn Brown, I'm the president of the World Affairs Council of Greater Reading. And I'd like to bring up right now our sponsor for this event, and that's Sam Dalal, who will say a few words to us.
Thank you, Lynn. Welcome all. Thank you, Lynn, for giving me a few moments to speak and deliver my message. On the left, you see a jug, half full of water. That is knowledge. Okay, on the left, that's it. Now, crow is considered to be an intelligent bird. He was thirsty. How could he quench his thirst? So what he did, he collected pebbles, small pebbles, put it in the jar. So the water level rose. When the water level rose, he could put his beak and drink water. Friends, knowledge is like that. It's very deep. But in order to gather it, you would make small efforts. Doesn't matter where you are, no matter what you do, no matter whom you get, collect small pebbles so you can gather the knowledge and quest your thirst for knowledge. And that's very important. It's not enough to learn. The most important thing is to understand what you're learning. Secondly, analyze what you have learned. And the last, apply what you learn. Normally what happens is that you won't get degrees. And I've been teaching in college. But at the end of the day, ask them what is, oh, we don't know. And I don't know answer. Once you are there in the front, you have to have all the answers. We don't want problems, we want solutions. And next, for all others, World Affairs Council is like that crow. We are quest for knowledge. And what we are doing is that, what our motto says is that, we are bringing the world to you. So please help us by putting as many pebbles you can in it, doesn't matter how you do it, so we can all work together. Someone has said that if you want to go fast, go alone. But you want to go far, walk together. My friends, we all walk together. We all walk together so we can go far. And I need your help, each and every one of you. May it be students, maybe our guests, or maybe our members. Please pass on this message to whomever you can and reach out and reach someone. And also, now there's 4 people might invite. Okay, fine, they have a good lunch here. But let me tell you, they are going to be a member of this organization. So I make them do it. That's the only way you can progress. Thank you very much.
Board member of the World Affairs Council. Right now I'd like to ask Nevin Hollinger just to say a minute to us about what's coming up with Public Global Tribute.
Thanks so much. I told Lynn that it would only take me a minute, and it might even take me less. October 18th, and you've heard me say this now 3-4 months. October 18th, I anticipate that all of you are going to be joining us at the Canal Street Pub for Public Global Tribute. Great event. It's to help support the Alan Miller Scholarship Fund, which just began this year. It's sponsored by the World Affairs Council, and we will provide scholarships for Berks County seniors who are pursuing degrees in international relations, political science, or public administration. My tickets are in my left pocket here, and it is burning a hole. As you leave, Jane Weber and I will be outside in the outside area selling tickets, and we'd love to have you purchase one for October 18th. More importantly, we want to see you on October 18th for Public Global Tribute. Thanks so much.
We had a wonderful morning this this morning at Governor Mifflin High School with Jenny Town, who's our speaker today. Her topic is nuclear negotiations with North Korea, moving beyond summit diplomacy. And Jenny is a research analyst at the Henry Stimson Center and a managing editor and producer of 838 North, a web journal that provides policy and technical analysis on North Korea. She's the former assistant director of the U.S.-Korea Institute at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where she focused on North Korea and Northeast Asia regional security. She's an expert reviewer for Freedom's House Freedom in the World Index, where she previously worked on the human rights in the North Korea project. With that, let me turn it over to Jenny.
First of all, thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the World Affairs Council and to Lynn. You still can't hear me. Can you make it a little louder? How is this? Can you hear me in the back? A little better. A little bit better? Good? Alright. Alright, if you can't hear me throughout this, just, flag me down. So, and I'm going to move around a little bit because I think it's more interesting. As you can tell, I'm not your typical DC person. I'm not going to give you the typical DC line today about North Korea. I have been studying this issue for over a decade professionally, working on it professionally. I have also had track 2 experience, actually talking with North Korean officials, especially some of those that are involved in the negotiation process right now. So trying to get a better sense of, what are we dealing with? What does North Korea want? How is our approach not meeting those needs? And so there's a lot that we'll talk about today. And it's great to see, I was telling Lynn, I really like to get out of DC and talk to non-DC audiences because, as Sam was talking about, you guys actually want to learn stuff, which is very refreshing. So let's get started. So it's really quite incredible to think that last year around this time you had President Trump speaking at the UN General Assembly, giving his famous Rocket Man speech, calling Kim Jong-un Rocket Man, basically threatening war if North Korea continued to test missiles at the pace that they were doing. And you saw this incredible personal response from Kim Jong-un. This was unprecedented for him to issue a personal response to this speech that was given at the UN. Sort of a chilling statement, calling President Trump, of course, the infamous dotard, crazy old man, and basically showing he wasn't going to be intimidated. And so we really were last year in a very dangerous place, and I spent a lot of time in the region, and I can tell you that especially in South Korea, Japan, they were very nervous that we were literally one miscalculation, one accident, one sort of ego-stroking action away from conflict that could easily escalate into the Second Korean War, and a war that could very easily turn nuclear. So this year, we're in a definitively different political space. And we'll talk a little bit about how we got there. It did start first with South Korea. It actually started first with North Korea. We'll get into that. But now we have such a different space. We have summits going on. We've normalized this culture of meeting with Kim Jong-un, with all the leaders of South Korea, US, China, you have Russia, Japan trying to get meetings with him. It's a very different world than where we were last year. And there's very little appetite to go back to where we were and to go back to that tension. I think most of us in the room can agree we don't want there to be war. However, the question is the track that we're on sustainable right now? President Moon of South Korea has said that we are now so far forward it is irreversible to go back to where we were, and I would question that, to say that the stakes are high, but it's still a fragile situation. And so talk a little bit about what's at stake. Why does North Korea matter? And I guarantee 2 years ago, if we had had this conversation about North Korea, this room would be about half the audience it is now, maybe less. North Korea is not a country that most people pay much attention to unless they're doing provocations. And until the president started to really ramp up the rhetoric between our countries. But the reason why it matters now and why it's become such a big deal is North Korea's nuclear weapons program and the threat that it poses to the region as well as to the United States. And what this looks like is, North Korea has done about 6 nuclear tests now, each of progressively higher yields. They've demonstrated high-yield nuclear weapons that presumably are in the range of hydrogen bombs, thermonuclear weapons, based on the amount of nuclear material that they're able to produce. The estimates of their arsenal are around 50 to 60 nuclear weapons now. If they continue producing nuclear material at the rate that they're doing now, they could have arsenals up to about 100 nuclear weapons by 2020. So, to put that in perspective, Israel has 80 nuclear weapons. India, Pakistan each have about 110, 120 nuclear weapons. So you're talking about a small nuclear armed state. Also, historically, North Korea has had short and medium-range missiles that could reach targets in the region, especially in South Korea and Japan. Last year, they demonstrated for the first time longer-range, intermediate-range ballistic missiles that could reach as far as Guam, as well as intercontinental ballistic missiles that could reach the continental United States. And this is really when the U.S. started to wake up. I think, prior to that, this threat that North Korea poses, people in South Korea and Japan have lived under this threat for decades. Last year, it was the first time that the U.S. really internalized this as a threat, a formidable threat to the United States as well. In addition, again, they do have a pretty extensive production infrastructure to produce more fissile material that is both a plutonium program as well as a highly enriched uranium program. And they also have chemical and biological weapons that can be used in a crisis. And these stocks are generally kept in decentralized locations throughout the country, making it an even more complex situation. And I just want to stress at this point that, despite how this program looks, North Korea does not pose an imminent threat. It does pose an existential threat. So the idea that just because now they have intercontinental ballistic missiles does not mean they're going to start shooting them at the United States and start a war. This is not the intention of the program, and North Korea knows that if it were to go down that path, it would be met with actual fire and fury. But the reality is that because they do have these capabilities, it is something that needs to be taken seriously, as at the very least they can threaten war. And the potential effects of war on the Korean Peninsula, we saw the first Korean War where you had millions of Koreans and millions of soldiers die. A second war could have equal numbers of casualties, if not more, especially in South Korea and likely Japan. But you also have, for some people, and especially some of our policymakers, the human factor doesn't seem to be enough to convince them that war is not an option. But what you do have also is some of the largest economies in the world. You have China, you have Japan, you have the United States, you have South Korea, you have peripherally also Russia in that mix. And so any kind of conflict on the Korean Peninsula is going to have global economic repercussions. And there was just recently a report that came out by the Economist Intelligence Unit that also talked about what that would translate into in terms of U.S. jobs directly if those pipelines and those markets in South Korea were to go down. So it isn't just war over there, as Senator Lindsey Graham has said. It is war that would have ripple effects throughout the globe. And if it goes nuclear, it would have environmental impact that would last for decades. So the problem is we've been dealing with this issue for a very long time, and not always in the most productive ways. So part of this reason why we keep going back to these old policies and these old tactics is that, North Korea is of limited concern to U.S. policymakers. It has not been a high-level foreign policy issue, unlike what it is now. It's a small country, it's a poor country, it's not a resource-rich country. And again, usually the most energy and the most efforts that we spend on it is when North Korea is being provocative. And outside of that, it sort of slips out of the mind because it sort of slips down in importance. And because of this, though, you have very few people who actually study Korea. Korea is often looked at in the context of big power politics, right? So it's really couched in U.S.-China relations, China-Russia relations, China-Japan relations, U.S.-Japan relations. There's very little discussion about Korea itself and what Korea wants, whether it's North or South. Korea has been the victims of proxy wars for centuries, where it was big powers fighting for strategic influence, where the Koreans themselves tended to be somewhat in the way. And the Koreans know this, of course, and have become masters of strategic manipulation in that process in order to try and survive and not get crushed in this big power game. But because of this, though, you have a lot of history that's quickly forgotten, where you don't have a whole deep bench of Korea experts. You have a few Korea experts. And those who are then thrown into the mix, especially in the government side, are looking for easy answers, are looking for kind of an easy way to understand the situation. And what happens is that the complex history of US-DPRK relations on the nuclear issue tends to get oversimplified into 25 years of failed negotiations, which isn't necessarily true. It loses a lot of nuance in that process. So you've had some negotiations that were productive. During the agreed framework, it was able to curb North Korea's plutonium production program to the point where before the agreed framework, North Korea was on a track to build enough infrastructure to have enough fissile material to build at least 100 nuclear weapons by 2000. They started with just a handful, just a small stockpile of plutonium, and by the end of the agreed framework, they still only had a small stock of plutonium. So it was successful in that sense of curbing the plutonium program before North Korea was able to move forward and pursue nuclear weapons. But a lot of this is lost, and so each time there have been some negotiations that were more successful than others and had better outcomes than others. But we have this common narrative of like, oh, but since we have a North Korean nuclear problem now, everything has failed. It's not true. But what happens now is because you have the narrative of everything has failed, diplomacy requires real bravery on the part of our politicians to be able to shoulder the criticism that comes with making that decision of going down that road again. Because there's no shortage of skepticism, there's no shortage of criticism, there's a lot of people waiting in the wings to, waiting for this to fail to be able to say like, I told you so, and how could you be so naive? So, diplomacy costs a lot of political will, a lot of political capital. And, it's one of those things where it isn't our highest priority, and it hasn't been our highest priority. So it's an issue that seems to be easy to shelve, kick down the road, let someone else deal with it. And so I like to use the analogy of the Rubik's Cube. So have you all used a Rubik's Cube? Has anyone solved it? A couple people, right? So I think the Rubik's Cube is actually the perfect analogy, right? Because it is solvable, but not everyone can do it. And it's difficult. And there are times where you can get like one side right or two sides right, and the other sides are still wrong. You know, the thing is like when you're playing with a Rubik's Cube, you try really hard the first time to show how smart you are, that you can solve this puzzle. And then you get really frustrated and you set it aside for a while. And you might go back and try it again, and the next time you're willing to put less energy into it. And the next time you try again, you're willing to put less energy, you have less patience for it. So every time you try, the amount of time you're willing to invest in it is shorter and shorter and shorter until eventually you're just like, look, I'm not going to solve it. And you set it aside and you put it away. So then there's people like me who don't like to lose. And so you try, you get frustrated, you try it a few times, you get frustrated, and then you're like, look. And you start peeling those stickers off. Putting it where you want them. So you can show all your friends how smart you are. You solved it. But I can tell you, after you peel those stickers off, when you stick them back on, they don't stay on very long. And the boxes are still in the wrong places. And the problem is, once those stickers fall off, you don't know where they were supposed to have been, right? So I feel like this is a perfect analogy for U.S. policy towards North Korea over the years. And so it's a situation where, again, you've tried, you've put in the effort, you've twisted, you've turned, you've gotten there. The next time that comes around, the next group is less willing, is not willing to put as much energy. And every time there's less and less patience, less and less energy put into that effort. During the Obama administration, you've gotten to the point where they were so frustrated, like, let's just set it aside. We have strategic patience. We'll wait for North Korea to make the right decision, and then we'll deal with it. So now we have the Trump administration, and Trump is peeling those stickers off like crazy. And so he's showing all of his friends, look, we fixed it. But of course, how long those stickers will stay on is a good question, and what happens when they fall off. And I think this is really where we are right now. So how did we get here? If we talk about the summit process, again, it really started with North Korea. North Korea, in its New Year's speech, made an opening salvo to South Korea, welcoming a new type of inter-Korean relations, and it also said that it wanted to participate in the Pyeongchang Olympics. And so President Moon, who's of the Liberal Party in South Korea and who had wanted, is known for being pro-North Korea, had wanted a summit with Kim Jong-un, really seized that opportunity and went all out to make arrangements for North Korea to participate in the Olympics, and was very skillful in being able to then transition that negotiation from just the participation into a security dialogue and talking about how do we actually improve inter-Korean relations, how do we reduce tensions, and how do we deal with the security situation on the Korean Peninsula in terms of, also the nuclear issue. So then President Moon has a lot at stake here because South Korea cannot go too far in the inter-Korean agenda without cooperation from the United States. And so the next step was to get the U.S. involved, and President Moon was also very adept at getting Donald Trump to agree to a meeting with Kim Jong-un, starting off a very different political process, a very different diplomatic process, because this is not the way the U.S. normally does diplomacy. But in doing so, by getting a meeting on the books, for Kim Jong-un to get a meeting on the books with both President Moon and President Trump, then the Chinese had to insert themselves in the process. They were not about to be sidelined. They wanted to know what was going on. They wanted to make sure that their interests were addressed and reserved within these two parallel bilateral processes. And so in order to do that, they pulled Kim Jong-un very close and kept North Korea very close in order to sort of lean on Kim Jong-un to carry China's water in these other negotiation processes. What it's done is it's normalized this high-level diplomacy with Kim Jong-un. And think of it. Last year, at the end of last year, North Korea was the pariah state. Kim Jong-un was sort of the ultimate villain. Everyone loves to hate Kim Jong-un. And now he's kind of a rock star. You know, when he was, the greeting that he got in Singapore during the Singapore summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un, you know, the way he was greeted, people were lining up to get pictures with him, to take pictures of him, to shake his hand. You know, you have President Abe now trying to get a meeting with him. You have the Russians setting up a meeting for him to go to Moscow. So he's become sort of the golden boy of diplomacy in the Korean Peninsula. It's a very quick rehabilitation of his image. So now, as we go forward, the two Koreas are really setting the pace of diplomacy, and especially Moon Jae-in is really driving this process to be very rapid, very forward-leaning, and it's really forcing the U.S., for instance, to keep this issue top of mind. So it is a process where the U.S. Is very uncomfortable with the pace. The Chinese are very uncomfortable with the pace. But the Koreas, by forging ahead, are really forcing the world to pay attention to them. But that does not necessarily mean they're in control of the outcome of the issue, simply that they're determined to keep it on the agenda. So for the US and South Korea, this has caused a little bit of tension in the alliance itself. And the idea is, you know, right now what we're dealing with is not just a denuclearization process. It's not just about denuclearizing North Korea. We're dealing with now a peace and denuclearization process. And the question becomes, what comes first? What is that sequencing? Can you have peace before North Korea gives up its nuclear weapons? Can you have peace with a nuclear North Korea? Or does North Korea have to give up its nuclear weapons before you can have peace? And I can tell you, in the North Korean perspective, the road to denuclearization is paved with a fundamentally different political relationship with the United States and the rest of the world. So when they talk about needing security guarantees, these are not just words on paper, because words on paper, you know, paper is paper. And we've all seen how agreements have kind of, you know, they get signed and they get violated and they go away, especially in political transitions here in the United States. So what you have is, you know, in order to have faith that, you know, if North Korea gives up its nuclear weapons, that the United States is not going to attack them, it requires a relationship of trust that's going to take a while to build. And part of that relationship of trust deals with this peace issue. And so this is why this end of war declaration has become so controversial and so important to the denuclearization, the nuclear negotiations, is because in the Korean concept of this, we need those steps to be simultaneous. We need to be going down both paths at the same time, in order to actually have a sustainable solution. And so, you know, and the reality is too, is that for South Korea, again, pushing for this end of war declaration to start the peace process, while it does have a high cost, South Korea cannot move very far on the inter-Korean agenda without US cooperation. And the US is not going to move very far until there's substantive movement on the denuclearization front. So these two processes are intimately intertwined. And the US and South Korea don't necessarily agree on the approach right now, which is causing some problems because South Korea wants to move very quickly, wants to move on the economic front especially. The US is not willing to lift sanctions right away or give exemptions for South Korea to move forward, and so there comes a credibility factor here where South Korea has made a lot of commitments now to the North that they will not be able to implement without cooperation from the United States. And so that's why there's such urgency these days from the Moon administration towards the Trump administration to keep moving down this road. And certainly, though, these asymmetric moves, Korea moving too far forward, forcing the issue too much can cause friction in the alliance itself, which can actually backfire in the long run and may end up derailing both processes out of disputes. So what we have, though, in this is we also have to keep in mind this process is very tied to this particular cast of characters. It's very personality driven, and especially from Kim Jong-un, Donald Trump, and Moon Jae-in. This is a very top-down leader process where you have all these high-level summits, and this is where the action is happening. And I think what's unique about these leaders is that they all have a very high resilience to criticism. We've all seen it here in the U.S., in South Korea as well. Moon Jae-in has been moving very far forward, even faster than what some of his own party are comfortable with, but he's willing to shoulder that criticism because he believes in what he's doing and believes there's a path forward. The problem with having such a top-down approach is that inherently when you have the leaders negotiating, you're going to lack some of the detail on the implementation side. And so now we have agreements that have overall broad principles with very few details as to what that actually means and how we're supposed to accomplish that, what those benchmarks are, and how do we move forward, what are the expectations. But it has, all of these guys have really bought into this made-for-TV summit diplomacy. And so in the near future, this is what we should expect to see, is more seasons of North Korea negotiations. But there's a lot of challenges ahead still. It's going to be a very bumpy road, and part of that is when you have such a public negotiation process, it's very difficult to manage expectations. And we've seen this even in such things as in the latest declaration made between the two Koreas in Pyongyang. When Moon Jae-in came back and gave his readout, he talked about how North Korea had committed to shutting down Yongbyon, their nuclear scientific research center, where their nuclear reactors are and their uranium enrichment program are. If the U.S. does their corresponding measures. In the agreement itself, though, it actually says that, no, North Korea is willing to continue to take measures like shutting down Yongbyon if the U.S. takes corresponding measures. These are two very different things. Because what the North Koreans were saying is that, sure, there are things that can be negotiated, but they have to be negotiated. Whereas what Moon was saying was basically like, oh, no, they're going to do this. And you guys have to do something too. The nuance is there. So, in this process, it's incredibly important to have to manage the expectations of where we are, not only for the public, but also for our government officials themselves. Because again, when Moon gave his readout, the response from Secretary Pompeo was, oh, we applaud North Korea's commitment to shutting down Yongbyon and allowing US and IAEA inspectors. Well, nowhere in that declaration did North Korea commit to that. And so when you have these mismatched understanding of what's happening, you raise expectations very high as to what those next steps are, and those next steps are not going to be taken in that way. So if the U.S. thinks that this has already been committed, goes into the negotiation thinking they can sign off on it and work on something else, and then realize, no, we actually have to negotiate this and negotiate the details now, it can get very frustrating very fast and can derail the process. And the question now is, how do we move beyond these high-level summits to get to the working-level meetings to work out those details? So, we have the Singapore Summit Declaration, which sets basically an agenda and 3 very broad categories of improving relations, of building a peace regime, and of North Korea's denuclearization. So this is sort of the long-term goals, but what do these things mean? We don't know. And that still needs to be negotiated. But the problem is now is we've had these high-level summits, and so it's really undercut the persuasive power of the negotiators. And so what we have now is when the negotiators go in and present their proposal as to how we move forward, if the two sides don't agree, instead of putting in the work to hash out those details, they start writing letters to the boss. well, this is not a good negotiating format. And the question is, how do we reinstate, how do we re-empower those negotiators to be able to work out those details? And that's something that we really need to see going forward. Again, there's a potential credibility gap. Moon Jae-in especially has made a lot of big commitments in the latest declaration coming out of Pyongyang. The question is, can they be implemented? So on the inter-Korean front, it does rely heavily on cooperation from the United States in order to move forward with economic cooperation, in order to move forward with some of the military measures and confidence building measures, but also on a domestic level. So in South Korea, for instance, President Moon still has not been able to get the Panmunjom Declaration, the declaration coming out of the first summit, ratified in the South Korean National Assembly because he does not have majority in the National Assembly. And so, the latest, he's tried now twice to get that ratified. And the latest feedback from the opposition party that's been holding it up is, let's see the numbers. What does this mean in terms of budget implications? And these are other, domestic factors that are going to make a difference in how these commitments are actually implemented. And if progress isn't made in sort of in a reasonable amount of time, you're also going to see frustration build up on all sides that could also derail the process. Certainly the US and South Korea, again, have not necessarily agreed on the approach, have not necessarily been consulting on everything they should be in this process, and that does hurt the overall leverage and bargaining power of the US and South Korea as allies. And so better coordination is needed, and domestic complications, of course, will always factor into this because, again, this process is highly contingent now on that cast of characters. So here in the US, this could potentially be a problem if further actions get taken against President Trump, if movements are taken to impeach him, what happens then to the negotiation process? So when it comes to the prospects for success, can this work? Certainly, there's reason to be optimistic. We do have a new opportunity here that we haven't seen for a very long time.